Well, hello again, friends. Welcome to Investment Immigration Conversations. I'm your host, Carolyn Lee, principal and founder of Carolyn Lee PLLC, a U.S. investment immigration law firm dedicated to helping clients build their futures with investment immigration. And these are clients on the U.S. side raising EB-5 capital and foreign investors bringing that capital to the United States. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am just so delighted that I have two of my favorite people joining us today, Suzanne Lazicki and John Pratt. These are preeminent experts in EB-5 with a wealth of advocacy effort behind them as well. You know, I have just incredible memories of John, going to USCIS engagement meetings and standing in that long line and getting up there and asking the hard questions, pressing for investor protection. And Suzanne, your work literally speaks for itself with your words, your analysis, your spreadsheets, some of which we're going to get into today. So the respect that both of you have in our space is incredibly well-deserved. And I am just so delighted and honored to call you friends.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to talk today about a pretty complex topic, visa numbers, so critical to everything we do, and yet so opaque, so difficult to understand. And we don't have a lot of numbers. These aren't big numbers, of course. The supply is constrained. And yet, really understanding how these numbers function is so elusive. And that's what I'm hoping to do today with the help of my friends and these experts, is to try to unpack together and to elevate our own understanding. I mean, our own right here, and the understanding of everybody who tunes into this later video as a resource. So I think we're all on board with that. Allow me, I am going to do a little share screening and looking at data together. And let me start with this. All right. And I start with this by way of background. And this may look familiar to some of you. I first presented this in one of my webcasts with Suzanne, actually, where we were talking about this, visa numbers. And this was kind of early on. We were trying to get a sense of the lay of the land, and we have a better sense of it. So the background in a nutshell is that we have a quota system. We have a certain number of visa numbers that can be given out by the U.S. Department of State every year. Now, the annual employment limit for these limited number of visas is 140,000 in a normal year, plus any unused that come over from the family-sponsored side of the quota. EB-5 gets its allocation, its portion of that worldwide limit, and that portion is 7.1%, which comes out to about 9,940, again, in a normal year. Now, here's where the RIA comes in. Under the RIA, we now have 4 categories of visas carving up this 9,940. We have a category called unreserved. This is a residual category. And this category has 62% of the total annual EB-5 limit. And so in a normal year, that's about 6,758 or 59, depending on how you round. And then we have these reserved categories, these 3 reserved categories that are also referred to as set-asides because they're set aside from the main pool. And these set-asides also have their own percentages. So together they total 32. And that 32 is carved up this way. 20% of the 32 go to rural petitions affiliated with rural projects. And that is about 2,000. Then we have 10% of the set-asides dedicated to high unemployment area projects, and that gets us to a little under 1,000. And then we have this new set-aside category called infrastructure. It's 2%, and that is about 200. Also, by way of background, continuing on, because this is an important part of the story, in fiscal 2022, this is the year from October 2021 to September 2022, we had a glut of additional numbers because there were so many unused from the family-sponsored side of the equation due to COVID-related consular closures. So we had this extraordinary 281,507 in the employment-based categories. EB-5, our share of it was about 20,000, and these are how the numbers shook down along each of these percentage sub-allocations for fiscal 2022. Now, none of these numbers was used in 2022 because the RIA came into effect in March of 2022. And these numbers are only taken down or used upon petition approval. So petitions were started to be filed in 22, but none was approved in 2022. And therefore, under the operation of the RIA, these unused set-aside numbers rolled over into the same set-aside categories in the following year, in fiscal 2023. And so we have these numbers, these 2022 numbers that are in green, that rolled right on over 100% in fiscal 2023, which was last year. And so last year, starting from the top, we still had additional numbers coming over to the employment-based side. And our allocation of that was about 14,000. So you see, it's still well over our normal limit. And then you carry the math down to the proportions for the set-asides. And together we had in the set-aside category, 10,873 as compared with the normal 3,192. Wow. Okay, so now we're in fiscal 2024. This is fiscal 2024. It will end September 30 of this year. We had some additional numbers. We had 165,000, and this is how it all split up. In unreserved, we had a total of 14,000, a total of 14,360. About 5,140 in the rural set aside, 2,570 in the high unemployment area set aside, 514 in the infrastructure set aside. And these numbers are in pretty close agreement across the board with private sector estimates, with the State Department numbers as well. So these are not controversial. And so today we're going to look together at what we're looking at going forward in fiscal 2025. This is going to be a bit of crystal ball gazing, admittedly, because we don't have all the data in terms of usage for 2024. We have some, but we don't have all, obviously, because the fiscal year is still, we're in the middle of it. But we have some numbers, and we have some State Department estimates as well. And so I'm going to call in on our friends to help me kind of try to unpack. To address questions to Suzanne and John, I want to pull this up. Sources are very important. Where do we go? How do we even begin to understand? One of the sources is Suzanne's incredible blog, and I'm going to flip to that in a moment. She has an incredible spreadsheet there, which really we can spend the whole time on. And essentially, this is about that. I want to start by asking folks, another is IIUSA and the data that is produced by IIUSA. And this write-up by Lee from IIUSA summarizes insights from a panel of the state attended by, or it had Dr. Hanley from the State Department, who is the State Department's expert in administering the RIA numbers. And this document summarizes that panel discussion. And I want to focus first, I want to start asking you, Suzanne and John, about this first point, because it ties to our conversation about what we can look ahead to. It says final action dates will remain current for all EB-5 set-aside categories during the remainder of 2024, which I think we're all kind of thinking yes, and likely throughout fiscal 2025. Is that your understanding as well, based on State Department statements and PowerPoints and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that based on the published data that I've seen from FOIAs and otherwise, and their public announcements, it seems like it will remain current through obviously 2024, very likely, and most likely through fiscal year 2025 because of the percentage that are being used or taken up from the categories. There's a concern that there's a lot in the pipeline, but it may not go through that pipeline in order for them to be used up and retrogress or not be current. That's what I've heard, at least from the data that people have gone through FOIA and otherwise. And I don't know if Suzanne agrees with that or disagrees.
Yeah, I agree with that too. And I think it's important to think about, what does it mean that final action dates remain current? What that means is they don't have enough applicants, or the applicants they have at the visa stage is fewer than the visas they have to give out. And because they don't have a crowd, they don't have to put on the traffic light to control the crowd. So we also need to think about, to what extent is it a good thing that they don't have enough applicants at the visa stage to max out supply?
Yeah, and this is what folks mean by the invisible backlog, right?
Correct. And to me, just to another analogy to me is, you have an occupancy on a restaurant, and there's not enough people inside of the restaurant yet to be used, but there's a lot of people waiting on outside of the restaurant to get in. So that's the phantom, possible backlog that will occur at one point when they're processing it.
Right. I also think about a airport analogy that I often use, where let's say they've sold 1,000 tickets. There are 500 seats on airplanes that are taking off, and those airplanes are taking off every hour, regardless of whether there are people in those seats. And all those ticket holders are mostly in airport security, not able to get to the gate. And is it a good thing for them that those flights are taking off empty? Mm-hmm. And for the people who are waiting in line, no, it is not, because they're going to have to wait longer the more seats leave.
And that assumes that those seats are going to leave and they're gone, which I think we need to come back to.
In the EB-5 scenario, it's half of the seats come back. So yeah, it's not as simple as that.
Yeah, but we're going to come back to that point, I hope. The restaurant analogy too is really fascinating, because it largely works. The restaurant could be empty, and that belies the fact that you've got a line of people waiting, far exceeding the occupancy, as you just put it, John. but it's different in that everybody is still, in that analogy, folks in line, they're not getting an amuse-bouche to wait. But in our scenario, there is a very important benefit, even though they can't come in and dine yet, right?
Yeah, that's important to point out.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
and I think, but I mean, this is a
it's
restaurant,
concurrent
right? And
adjustment of status, just for folks who may not know what we're talking about. We're talking about the ability for folks, for investors, to be able to concurrently file their adjustment of status while there is visa availability, i.e. no visa backlog reported on the visa bulletin.
Correct. But to me, then that adds 2 lines to that restaurant, right? One line where they have, you could go inside of a building and sit down with an adjustment of status where you could concurrently file it. And when they get to it, if they retrogress, etc., you still have your adjustment file and all your benefits and your EADs, etc. But if you're consular processing and it retrogresses, then you're waiting outside in the cold and the rain and everything else. So that it's current right now for a concurrent file. You at least get the benefit to stay in the United States. You get your EAD, you get your advanced parole, etc. But if you're consular processing, when that phantom line eventually materializes, and then there's a cutoff date, those people outside of the United States have to wait until they become current again, or they could continue.
And this is why trying to understand demand is the game. We know what the supply is. We have a much, much better handle on the supply, and that's what I just showed you. But we don't have as good a, for a number of reasons, on the demand. What is the line out there for the limited number of seats? All right, so
Carolyn, before you
Yeah.
move on, I just like to point out that the answer to this question, when will the final action date stop being current, it's actually not a question about demand so much as a question about the speed of the process. Because for high unemployment, we know that there are a number of people who at least filed their petitions checking the high unemployment box, that if all of them got to the visa stage and actually asked for a high unemployment visa, that would way max out the supply. The reason why we don't think, or why we're guessing that that's not actually going to happen this year and maybe not even next year, what we're guessing about is how slowly the process is going to move those people to the visa stage. And considering that up till now, the Immigration Service has been adjudicating about 50 I-526E per month, it's going to take forever to get for all those people to get to the visa stage at that rate.
Well,
and so it's that slowness that's making us think.
In part, right.
Yeah. But that could speed up. And if the process speeds up, that's what would make the final action date change come earlier.
Right. So yeah. Now I just want to point out something interesting here. We complain. Right? We complain a lot about, among other things, processing times. And with good reason. I mean, look at the reported processing times. I don't look anymore, but last I checked, it was like 56 months for a 526 or something of that nature. So, and yet it is the protracted processing times that gives the, call it what you will, illusion. The numbers remain available. Visa numbers remain available. And what that means is, on the one hand, yes, we don't have great visibility into the length of the line, but it does keep the concurrent adjustment of status availability open as well.
And this is the complexity, Carolyn, which you just pointed out. That's why I was saying that there's 2 lines inside of the restaurant. One, it's covered with air conditioning, etc. The other one is out there, with cold and rain and everything. To me, the people waiting at the consulates, because I think the word demand still applies. It's demand to pull the visa numbers because USCIS acted on it and approved it and they're qualified, etc. But if you file the so the lack of speed is making the availability to file a concurrent filing available right now through fiscal year 2024 through fiscal year 2025. Although we know that had USCIS acted quickly on those petitions, that would have disappeared. So the slow progress of USCIS has actually worked in the benefit of investors who could benefit from a concurrent file I-526, because the demand at the Department of State to pull the visas to go into these categories has not been realized yet.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So just to summarize, who's hoping that the visa bulletin is going to change as soon as possible, and who's hoping it will wait as long as possible?
Yeah.
I think the people who are hoping it will wait as long as possible are investors who haven't filed yet, because the longer if they're in the US, because the longer the visa bulletin stays open, the more opportunity they have to file I-526, file adjustment of status, get in. The people who are hoping that the visa bulletin will change as soon as possible are EB-5 investors who already filed, because they want the most people to exit who are in front of them in line, to get out of the line and get visas. They want that to happen as quickly as possible.
Which kind of leads me to the second point here.
But let me just point one thing though, Carolyn, because
Yeah.
I think concurrent filing changes a little bit of that analogy, Suzanne, because at least with concurrent filing, ultimately the person gets to live in the United States and get the benefit of employment authorization, etc. And in the concurrent file adjustment of status, even if there's retrogression, the adjustment continues. So you still get some benefit. Now I get it. The ultimate benefit is me getting the green card, but at least they still continue to get the benefit to reside in the United States, work, travel, and do everything else in the United States with that concurrently file adjustment of status, Carolyn, which is a significant benefit that the IRA added.
Right. I was actually thinking of when the date for filing changes.
Okay.
So I guess when the final action date changes, you're right, it doesn't affect new applicants. It's when the visa bulletin chart B also has the date, and so they can't even file for adjustment of status. That will be a damper for new applicants.
Yeah. And so that kind of is a segue to this point here, which is that Dr. Hanley reported that the unreserved cutoff for China and India are expected to remain unchanged for the remainder of fiscal 2024. So that's, what is it? Was it 2017 for China and 2020 for India?
Yeah, I think it's December 15, 2015 for China, and December 1st, 2020 for India, based on the August visa bulletin.
Yep, which just
Suzanne
came
is
out.
the expert on numbers. So.
in the unreserved. So what do we make of that? So Suzanne, help us understand this. So we have, we just saw that we have all those numbers, extra numbers. Thank you. And we've had them for a couple of years now. How come these unreserved cutoff dates are sluggish?
It's because these cutoff dates for China and India are very generous already. There are a lot of people with priority dates earlier than that who are still in the system. And we know that partly thanks to Michael Hanley in his presentation, he gave a chart of the number of people they have at the National Visa Center by their priority date who are still in the inventories. You can go and look there and count up the number of people from China and India who are before the current cutoff dates. And USCIS has recently started publishing the same data for what they've got in the inventory for adjustment of status. And you can count up the number of people from China and India who have visas who have applications before those priority dates. So
this is really
when you
important.
have more applicants than you have supply left, then you don't need to put the green light, because you already, enough people got through the green light last time that they'll be able to take available visas.
And so it isn't because, it isn't that the consulates are not issuing visas. Is that what you're saying? It's that they are issuing visas, but these dates are already behind the supply that's ahead of these dates.
well, the consulates are productivity is a factor also, but the number of applicants in the inventory with earlier priority dates exceeds the number of visas left for the year.
Right. Okay. So
they have no reason to change the visa bulletin to say bring in even more applicants when they already have a number of applicants that can take the visas they have available to issue.
So are you saying, Suzanne, that there may be a retrogression at some point?
I would certainly expect retrogression for India, at least, because the reason why they set the India date so far out is that they just didn't have that many Indians at the visa stage at all. USCIS had so many I-526 on file. This year, USCIS has been approving a huge number of I-526. They've really been cleaning out their inventory. So now all of a sudden you have a whole bunch more Indians who are at the visa stage and actually able to apply for visas.
And I think the point that you just discussed is important because, you know, ever since I've been an immigration attorney, the concept of retrogression is just so weird to me that they have a cutoff date and then the cutoff date could be earlier than the cutoff date that they've been publishing for months. So that's complexity to it. But I think what you're saying, Suzanne, is obviously they're very generous to this. What's in the pipeline will far exceed it. And once they get to their productivities and that demand that we're talking about, there is the possibility of going backwards, retrogressing.
For sure.
And I think it is important for people to remember, too, that when retrogression happens in the visa bulletin, that doesn't change their place in line.
No.
If you have a December 2019 priority date, that's still your priority date.
But I think the point that I was trying to make on the adjustment, Suzanne, is that if they're here, retrogression doesn't eliminate their adjustment of status. It could just continue. But if they're outside, it may make their wait longer to when the priority date becomes current again for them to get the immigrant visa. So the two lines may affect people differently.
I want to pivot. Point well taken, John. Can folks see this slide? This is the State Department presentation from Dr. Hanley.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So at the May IIUSA conference in Atlanta, this slide, this presentation was given by the State Department, and I want to kind of bring your attention to this. Low prorated limits in some set-aside categories mean that final action dates could be set in fiscal 2025. Final action dates could be set in fiscal 25 if China and India demand is high and the rest of world petitions pick up. Suzanne, what does this mean?
Low prorated limits in some set-aside categories. I think he's just pointing out that the number of visas we have in these categories is relatively small. And so one can foresee the possibility of getting enough incoming applicants to max out those low limits. And the reason why he mentions China and India and rest of the world there is that that they're all jostling for visas together. And so like if there were no rest of the world applicants, just China and India, then China and India can share the numbers. If there are a lot of rest of the world applicants, then China and India get nudged against more toward their country cap limits rather than just being able to take everything available.
Can we try to unpack the idea too? Because I thought that something else was suggested here. Is this idea that, holy cow, we may have a cutoff in the rest of world. Suzanne, I think you were kind of the canary in the mines on this potential scenario. Can you unpack that for us? When could that happen? When could we have, because we all kind of think, oh, eventually, if not in 2025, you know, and it might be in 2025, but if not, then certainly soon we would have cutoffs. for China and India in the set-asides. What about rest of world?
Well, just as far as the possibility of having a cutoff date for rest of the world, you can look at the fact that this happens just by looking at EB-1, 2, and 3 in the visa bulletin, which regularly have rest of the world cutoffs. That has never happened to EB-5 before, just because we've been able to sort of segregate the crowd in these couple high volume countries that get held back by the country cap limits. But what if you have excess demand for China, excess demand for India, and then also a lot of people in rest of the world? Can you just max out across the board? And that could happen in a year where, let's say, they give 7% of the visas to China, 7% of the visas to India, and then the 86% of the visas that are left, that number is too low for the number of rest of the world applicants.
So let's just break that down. So, I mean, let's look at, I mean, we could look at infrastructure. I mean, let's look at something, let's look at high unemployment. So these are the 2025 limits for the high unemployment set aside. And you're saying if the rest of world demand exceeds 1,837 collectively, we could have a rest of world cutoff.
That's what they would have to do.
Okay. So now I
But-
think is the time. Yeah.
Let's hear
One
John.
question, wouldn't they also need to look at, because every country has a per country cap, wouldn't you then have to slice up the rest of the world by which countries there are? Like in, like you said, in the EB2, you got Mexico, you got the Philippines in the EB2, EB3 category. So there's no rest of the world. Wouldn't they? It depends on which countries.
Like, let's say
that if they would just go by the ones that are in the visa bulletin, though. So it would also be Mexico, Philippines. Is there another one, or is it just Mexico and Philippines?
Mexico and the Philippines, but that's because those, like for example, in the EB2, EB3, there's a lot of nurses from the Philippines, etc. So again, I think that they
but
because
what
you
if
got
what if Taiwan or
correct
Nigeria,
Korea or whatever.
Hong Kong or Korea exceeded 150?
This they clarified, is it last year in the EB-4 visa bulletin announcement, they reemphasized that prorating under the country cap is only applied for countries that have in excess of 7% of demand across employment-based and family-based categories.
That's what is okay, right? That's very important.
Yeah, and that can change from year to year. So a couple years in the past, Vietnam was on that list that exceeded 7% across, but except for that handful of countries, none of the other countries have ever even been remotely close. So like for Nigeria is never going to be in excess of 7% across family-based and employment-based categories.
Right. And therefore,
so there's
rest
never going to
of
be a
the
column in the visa bulletin for Nigeria, no matter how popular EB-5 individually becomes
That's
in
an
Nigeria.
important fact to
Correct.
understand.
Unless the other categories become popular, like obviously Philippines, India, and the other categories. That was just the point that I was trying to say, that it's not just a other world category. It depends on some other factors across the board for employment base, etc., and by countries.
Yep. Now can I like pivot now, because I think that the discussion now is turning naturally to understanding demand. So it's like, so now we get, all right, so we have the numbers, we've got more this year, and we're going to continue to have more next year, fiscal 2025, and perhaps that will stave off cutoffs. I mean, I'm frankly, I am not going to blithely believe that we're not going to have cutoffs in 2025. But so let's look at that. I mean, what's it looking like in terms of the pull, the demand for the numbers in 2025? And so this is Suzanne's spreadsheet that I encourage everybody to study. It's on her blog. Suzanne, if you want to drop a link in the chat, please do. And, you know, this has got her chart online, has got the summary, you know, so this has got, you know, the supply that we just talked about. And she has tabs for other data categories, including pre-RIA demand, post, visa supply, unreserved, all of that. I want to focus on post-RIA demand. What do you want to tell us, Suzanne, just to kind of start, like laying the foundation to our just, you know, understanding usage?
Yeah, it's hard to know where to start. I guess
it's hard to know where to start.
We can talk about what we know and what we don't know, maybe.
All
what
right,
we know is how many people are filing I-526 and I-526C. We know totals because USCIS officially reports that. And then we know some breakdown by category because people have filed Freedom of Information Act requests on it. And I think this data by category and by country, possibly one reason that USCIS is reluctant to report it is that this is a little bit more dicey, I guess. That this is based on what boxes people check on their forms when they file them, which might not be the category that they end up getting approved in, or if it is one of the categories they get approved in, it might not be the category that they end up choosing. So, but just generally speaking, it is interesting to look at the number of people who are starting the process by saying, I'm putting myself in line for a visa in this category, at least at the point of filing I-526, and look at how these numbers are coming in the rural versus high unemployment category, and then China, India, and rest of the world. And
right. I mean, so all right. So we got to start somewhere. Let's start with some pretty basic stuff. So the data is showing us that thus far,
and then not thus far, this is up till November 2023,
right.
The chart you're looking at, which is the data that AIIA got through FOIA.
AIIA FOIA data cuts off November 2023. That was like eons ago now. So back then there were 3,578 RIA petitions filed. So, I mean, do you have any guesses, Suzanne, as to how many what's the number now, these 8 months later?
Well, in this file, I set up a whole bunch of different tabs just so I could sort of have some tabs that are facts and some tabs that are estimates.
Right.
So what you're looking at right now is a tab of facts. This is just all the data that I could pack rat, and so I put the data down, I put the source links. If you go to the HUA analysis tab, this is where I go and say, okay, let me take that data and let me play with it. And so on the left there, you see the facts. On the right, I have some ways to play with it. For example, in the top, I make some guesses. How many applicants would result from this number of people? Let's guess what the approval rate's going to be. Guess how many family members, and then that comes up with the total number. I also did a little section below that of let's guess what the monthly additions to that would be.
No, this is
awesome. It's above that. Yeah. So, but I would say that this sheet, it's important that everything that's yellow shaded here is not facts. This is just an input cell to input your guess and estimate. So I wouldn't want people to look at the bottom line of this and think, oh, this is the fact. This is a sandbox that I set up so that people can.
That's all we want. That's all we want is, what do we know? And then, you know, if it's a guess, if it's a prognostic, like if it's educated or not, if it's like a hopeful, if it's a wish, say that. Super helpful.
Okay, so just to clarify, the sheet we're looking at right now is it's a sandbox for making projections. This is not the facts. We can go back to the other sheet if you want just the facts.
And thank you. Yes.
Can I ask you a question, Suzanne? Because
yep,
you know that different nationalities, you know, have different number of children. Chinese families are generally smaller than a Vietnamese or an Indian family. Are you? And I had in a previous iteration at some point, the Department of State had derivatives percentages of, like, you know, one investor equals 2.3 derivatives. You know, one wife, 3 kids, one wife, 1 kid. Is that how you're basing some of your estimates, depending on the nationalities, that the average family size? Because that adds to the complexity.
Yes, Carolyn,
an Indian
if you
person
want
doesn't
to...
have the same number of children generally. An Indian couple doesn't have the same number of children as a Chinese couple generally.
Yep, Carolyn, if you want to scroll up on that sheet, on the applicants per principal there, I have a number that is is linking back. I don't know if you can see the formula, but it's linking back to the facts tab, where in the facts tab, it gives actual numbers in the past. And this number of family members per principal is a thing you really have to guess about, because not only are the averages per country pretty considerably different, but also the averages change over time. And this makes sense if you think about it, because these numbers represent people, and children get older. And so
they drop out
consistently
and then
over
they could have
time.
children.
Yeah.
And then there could be
like
divorces
for China,
and deaths.
The average family sizes in visas issued has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And I think that's because children have been growing up and growing up and growing up. So that number keeps going down.
Yeah.
But also the demographics in the world are changing. I mean, people are having those kids in some countries, or etc. But that affects those numbers. That was my question. Simply.
Yeah.
You're taking that into account in the estimates based on the countries.
And it sounds like the answer is yes. In your calculation.
Yes, but I do want people to enter their own estimates based on what they think and what they know. So, for example, what I have linked in here is like an average for the past 3 years for those countries. But you might think, oh, we shouldn't go back that far. Just the most recent year is the most relevant. I'm just going to use that. Or you may know something that marketing is now focusing on students. And that fact is going to make these family sizes change even more. So because
average,
when I'm making guesses, I'm taking what the facts we know about the past and projecting them into the future. And there are judgment calls in doing that.
Yeah.
And if I may, I'm sorry to have to. Does the Department of State have the same problem? They won't really know the family size until the very end, once they're documentarily qualified, because there's no, what's the mechanism for them to know what the true family size that will be seeking the visa?
Yeah, I think they do have an algorithm based on the data, you know.
But still an estimate. It's not.
Yes. What they've reported what they've reported to us is just the fact of what it's been in the past. They say in 2023, the Chinese principals were at this percent of visas issued. In 2022, they were that percent. So what we got, for example, at the IAUSA meeting, which I've copied into my facts data sheet here, is just about the past. And then we've got a guess about the future.
So, I mean, so these numbers are like literally awesome, like awe-inspiring, but so just at a super high level, I mean, what are they telling us? I'm coming back to the facts tab. I mean, what do you think this is? I mean, so now we're prognosticating. So as of November 2023, we had about 3,600 petitions, not visa applications. So where do you think we are right now, just in terms of the raw number of RIA petitions? I mean, and the number of petitions filed, I mean, not split up by set aside category or nationality. I mean, this we'll be able to get. I mean, I'm just asking whether you have it, because the service will publish quarterly the receipt data. But do you have a sense?
As of March 30th, 2024,
Yeah,
is the most recent. And this data report was a little bit confusing because there, March 31st, of course, is right the cutoff date when there was the huge surge of filings of people trying to beat the fee increase. And so I think what happened is that in updating their systems for that, the whole bunch of people who filed like on the 30th or whatever, they got those recorded in the received column. They didn't record them yet in the pending column. And so there ended up with about 1,000 petitions difference between the sum of receipts and the number pending. But so as of March, there were 4,000 post-RIA petitions pending. If you counted up the number of receipts since RIA, it was 5,300 though.
Wait. Okay. All right. So because that's only fiscal 2024. All right. So it's like 5,000 something range.
By the way, you don't have to write that down. That's on this sheet,
right
fact sheet as well, if you ever need it. Yeah.
All right. So, okay. All right. So it's about 5,000. I mean, that's helpful, I think. I mean, just 5,000.
If you want to scroll up on this fact sheet, at the very top, it gives the USCIS numbers on the number of receipts that have been coming in every month, and then the number that have been processed. And so you could, obviously the number of receipts coming in, it's really been a high and low, which makes it complicates if you want to project, well, we know what happened until March, what's happened through July. You can think, oh, do we think the most recent quarters were like January to March, or we think they were earlier? But I think an important thing to look at here too is the number of the total number processed. And it's this small number of total processed, which makes me think we're not getting a cutoff date for anytime soon, because people are going to the visa stage at a trickle, even though they're pouring in at the I-526 stage according to that receipts column.
Right. All right.
Wow. I ask a question, Suzanne? What do you mean by receipts versus pending? Do you mean receipts? There's the I-526 is received and immigration accepts it for. If you could explain the difference between receipts versus pending.
Okay. Well, I'm just saying that in theory, the number of pending petitions should be the number of petitions you received less the number of petitions you processed, right?
Right.
Yes. But if you make that equation, there's a 9,000 or 926 is the difference that doesn't fit in that equation. This number of pending petitions is not equal to the sum of receipts minus the sum of process.
Yeah. I mean, that's.
And I've noticed this happen in the past. They've just got a weird system where the number of pending petitions they report is sort of off by quarter, and then it will all come out in the wash at the end of the year.
Wow. Well, I don't know about folks, and John, I feel a little illuminated. Right? And that's what it is.
No, it's absolutely.
Sort of it's I find it extremely valuable. And again, these conversations and this data and kind of honestly presented is just such a gift.
One thing I don't know if you have comments on. One thing I've heard talked about recently is sort of the possibility of lane switching. Well, what if I'm a high unemployment applicant and my high unemployment lane is really crowded? Can I skip over to unreserved? Or even like infrastructure has nobody in it right now. And pre-RIA applicants who invested in infrastructure projects have thought, why couldn't I get an infrastructure visa? Do either of you have comments on that lane switching idea?
Yeah.
Well, I think the Department of State, or they've said that if you multiply for multiple lanes, you can pick that lane when you go to the consulate, which lane do you want. So, because there's approvals with a few different lanes. But it happens in other categories where you could upgrade or downgrade between EB2 and EB3. I think the Department of State is going to allow you to pick the lane if you qualify for more than one, and you have to have that educated guess by looking at all these numbers when you choose, because God forbid you choose the wrong lane at that point in time.
Yeah.
That's what I've heard so far, Carolyn.
I know. That's what's scary is about, because you're choosing a number, you're choosing a lane based on incomplete data, right? We're kind of like doing this. And what if?
But at a minimum, they're letting you choose that lane, the final lane, with a longer period of time where you may have more data to choose. So you're not bound.
But how is that going to be administered? Because if there's a cutoff in one of the categories, then the visa application will not go to interview. If that's the lane you chose.
But what I don't recollect, and maybe you do, is do you have to pick the lane when it goes to the NVC or when they send it to the consulate?
And that's the part that I'll have to look at this more closely.
Is it when it sends to the consulate and say, okay, you're ready for your visa interview?
Yeah, but I know that that's what it said, but I think you have to choose. You do have to choose right at the welcome letter stage when NVC process starts. And so I don't think one can proceed without choosing at that stage. And so whether one can then later change lanes, to use your analogy, Suzanne, we're told we can. I don't know how or when.
But I think this is where the point that I was trying to talk about, consular processing versus adjustment of status. When does the lane picking happen at the adjustment of status stage? Because you're not at the NVC. It would happen at your interview, most likely. And at your interview or at the adjudication of it, they will then look at what lanes available among the different lanes that you could qualify. So how that's going to work, I think it's unclear.
I don't know. Let's take some questions.
Two different systems. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's take some questions and then we're going to close because we've well exceeded. We actually envisioned this as a half an hour kind of check-in, but all right. So
with data, we could be here for a week.
Oh, I know, at least.
I should mention this Excel file. I keep it linked to my blog and I'm constantly working with it and changing into it and adding stuff to it. So
it's live. It is alive as well as live.
And you may have some mistakes in it at this point. I keep finding little mistakes. So if you find some, let me know. Will do.
Does the unreserved set aside change to rural or high unemployment if EB-5 project is rural or high unemployment? If not, what is their processing time compared to rural or high unemployment? Does the unreserved set aside change to rural or high unemployment if EB-5 project is?
I think they're asking if pre-RI, the applicants who have priority dates before the law change have an opportunity to qualify for the rural or HU, if in fact they applied in a rural or HU category. And Department of State's interpretation of that has been no. If you have a priority date before March 15th, 2022, you can only apply for an unreserved visa.
Although I will say, I do not believe that position is airtight. Although we know that there is some precedent on that front, but there's been a decision, but I don't think that lane is entirely cut off. Why would EB-5 visas in the pipeline not go through? Is the question about can you elucidate a bit? What do we mean not go through? Like, you don't mean denied. I mean, obviously if it's denied, it wouldn't go through. What do we mean by that? If
I wonder if the question is, why would applicants who are in the pipeline not actually make it to the finish line to get a visa? I don't know if that's
that
the
was
question.
to me that
Here
seemed
we
to me
go.
the question. For example,
Yes.
someone has a crime and they're inadmissible and they don't get it. So
Yeah.
how someone that started the process and they don't conclude with an EB-5 visa issuance to get the conditional green cards.
Mm-hmm.
Some fall off on their own, some do not get it for various reasons, right?
Yeah, there are.
Some children aged out, so you have less. So there's
Yeah.
different things that happen to the numbers upon whether the visa gets issued or not.
Well, all right. Well, John, Suzanne, thank you. Thank you for everything you do, and continue to do, no doubt. And let's just keep talking and, getting out quality information to folks. This is complicated stuff, and I think this conversation hopefully is helpful.
And thank you, Carolyn. I mean, you're one of the best, one of the smartest, and thank you for presenting all of this.
You're the best.
We appreciate you facilitating the conversations.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Have a great summer, and folks, we'll speak with you soon.